The fog clung to the marshes like a shroud, thick and unyielding, as Eliza Pendleton trudged homeward along the rutted path from the village. It was 1839, and the air in Blackwater Hollow carried the bite of early autumn, mingled with the faint rot of decaying reeds. Her skirts, heavy with mud, slapped against her ankles, but she paid them no mind. At 34, widowed these 3 years by the fever that had claimed her husband, Eliza had learned to ignore such trifles. Her hands, rough from mending nets and scrubbing floors, clutched a small bundle of bread and cheese, her wages from the seamstress's shop, meager as they were. The cottage waited at the edge of the hollow, a squat thing of weathered stone and thatch, its chimney belching thin smoke into the grey sky. As she approached, the door creaked open on its own, though she knew she'd latched it tight that morning. A chill prickled her skin, not from the wind, but from the unnatural quiet. No laughter from within, no patter of small feet. Her children, Thomas and little Mary, should have been waiting, their faces smudged with the day's play in the yard. "Eliza," came a voice from the shadows, soft and hesitant. It was Widow Hargrove, the neighbor who sometimes minded the children for a penny. She stepped into the doorway, her apron twisted in her gnarled hands, eyes wide with something like fear. "Oh, Eliza, it's the fever again. Come quick." Eliza's heart seized, the bundle slipping from her grasp to the damp earth. She pushed past the old woman, the fog seeming to thicken inside the cottage as if it had followed her. The room was dim, lit only by the dying fire, and the air hung heavy with the scent of herbs and sweat. There, on the low pallet by the hearth, lay Thomas and Mary, their small bodies limp beneath the threadbare quilt. Thomas, 8 years old and bold as brass, his curls matted to his forehead. Mary, just 5, her doll clutched in pale fingers. She dropped to her knees, gathering them close. Their skin burned hot against her palms, breaths shallow and ragged. "My darlings," she whispered, pressing her lips to Thomas's brow. He stirred faintly, his lips brushing hers in what might have been a sigh, or was it a kiss? No, just the fever's delirium. She turned to Mary, kissing her cheek, and again, that fleeting pressure, as if the child returned it in her sleep. Widow Hargrove hovered at the door, wringing her hands. It came on sudden, midday. "I tried the willow bark tea, but, they're slipping, Eliza. The doctor's miles off, and the bridge is washed out from last night's rain." Eliza nodded, her mind racing like the swollen creek beyond the hollow. The fever had taken her husband, and now it clawed at her babies. She couldn't lose them too. "Fetch the elderberries from the wood," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "And the yarrow. Boil it strong. I'll watch them." As the old woman shuffled out into the mist, Eliza held her children tighter, whispering promises into their fevered ears. The cottage seemed smaller then, the walls pressing in, and outside, the marshes whispered back, secrets in the wind, or perhaps just the echo of her own fear. But she swore, in that moment, that their lips had moved against hers, warm and insistent, as if begging her to fight. The fog clung to the moors like a shroud that morning, muting the distant cry of gulls over the salt marshes. Eliza Pendleton stood at the window of the parsonage, her fingers tracing the cold pane, watching the world dissolve into grey. It had been 3 days since the fever claimed little Thomas and Mary, their small bodies laid out in the parlor below, wrapped in white linen that now seemed too pristine for the earth that awaited them. The village undertaker had come and gone, promising a quiet burial at dawn, but Eliza could not leave them. Not yet. She turned from the window, her skirts whispering against the floorboards worn smooth by years of her pacing. The house felt hollow, as if the children's laughter had carved out chambers in the walls themselves. Downstairs, the air still carried the faint, sickly sweet scent of camphor and vinegar, the remedies that had failed. Eliza descended the stairs slowly, each step a negotiation with the ache in her chest. Brave in her solitude, she had always been the one to mend nets or birth lambs when the men faltered, but this was a tide she could not turn. In the parlor, the coffins waited, simple pine boxes nailed shut the night before. Reverend Hale had insisted on it, his voice steady but eyes averted as he murmured prayers over the forms. "God's will, Widow Pendleton," he had said, clasping her hand with a grip that felt more like restraint than comfort. Now, alone again, Eliza knelt beside the smaller coffin, the one holding Mary. Her daughter's face lingered in her mind, pale as moonlight, lips parted as if whispering secrets to the angels. Or perhaps to her. Eliza's hand trembled as she reached for the lid, but she stopped, remembering the undertaker's warning about the damp air swelling the wood. Instead, she leaned close, pressing her lips to the rough pine where Mary's cheek would lie beneath. "My sweet girl," she whispered, the words catching like thorns. And then, impossibly, a warmth bloomed against her mouth, a soft pressure, fleeting as a breath, returning the kiss. Eliza jerked back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The room spun for a moment, the single candle on the mantel flickering shadows that danced like fingers across the walls. It was nothing, she told herself, rising unsteadily. The house settling, or her own fevered imagination born of grief. But the sensation lingered, a ghost on her skin. She moved to Thomas's coffin next, larger and heavier, her son who had chased her through the fields with boundless energy. Kneeling again, she repeated the gesture, lips to wood. "Forgive me for not saving you," she murmured. The response came swifter this time, a deliberate nudge, cool yet insistent, as if Thomas were pressing back from within the dark. Eliza stumbled to her feet, backing toward the door. The parlor, once a place of stories by the fire, now pressed in with unnatural weight. She clutched the doorframe, breath coming in shallow gasps. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the path to the village. Who could she tell? The Reverend would call it hysteria, dose her with laudanum until she forgot. Her neighbor, old Mrs. Harrow, with her superstitious mutterings about Fay in the marshes, might listen, but at what cost? Whispers of madness could strip her of the parsonage, leave her wandering the moors like the beggars who came in winter. By midday, the doubt had rooted deep, but so had a stubborn resolve. Eliza busied herself in the kitchen, chopping root vegetables for a stew she had no appetite for, the knife's rhythm a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The children were gone, the kisses, tricks of the mind. Yet when she glanced toward the parlor door, left ajar, a chill traced her spine. From within came a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, a sigh, like wind through cracked boards. Or breath. She set the knife down, wiping her hands on her apron, and approached the threshold. The coffin sat unchanged, the candle burned low. But there, on the floor between them, lay a single ribbon, blue as Mary's favorite dress, though she had been buried in white. Eliza's knees buckled. She had folded that ribbon into the linen herself, tucking it away with trembling fingers. How had it come to rest here, coiled like a question? The afternoon waned, the light fading to a bruised purple through the grimy windows. Eliza could not bring herself to touch the ribbon. Instead, she barred the parlor door from the outside, the iron key cold in her palm, and retreated upstairs. Sleep evaded her, the bed too vast without the children's warmth beside her. In the quiet hours, she heard it again, from below, a faint rustle, like tiny feet shifting in their rest. Dawn crept in reluctantly, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the cart waiting in the yard. The undertaker, Mr. Grimes, arrived with his boy, their faces etched with the routine sorrow of their trade. Eliza met them at the door, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. "Be gentle with them," she said, handing over the key. Grimes nodded, his eyes flicking past her into the shadowed hall. "Of course, ma'am." The graves dug by the churchyard oak. As they carried the coffins out, one by one, Eliza followed to the threshold. The pine creaked under the weight, and for an instant, she swore she saw a small hand press against the lid from inside, pale, insistent. She blinked, and it was gone, just the warp of the wood in the morning light. Grimes paused, glancing back. "You all right, widow? Looks like you've seen a ghost." Eliza forced a smile, thin as the mist. "Grief plays tricks, Mr. Grimes. Nothing more." But as the cart rattled away toward the church, the ribbon burned in her memory, a thread unraveling the veil between worlds. She turned back inside, the house echoing emptier than before, and wondered what else might stir in the silence she had left behind. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Widow Pendleton knelt before the fresh mound of earth. Her knees sank into the damp soil, the chill seeping through her woolen skirts, but she paid it no mind. The air carried the faint rot of turned earth and something sweeter, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. Eliza's grave was smaller than the others, a pitiful patch beside her brother's, marked only by a crude wooden cross her husband had carved in better days. Pendleton traced the letters with a trembling finger, Eliza, each stroke a reminder of the fever that had claimed her just 2 nights past. She had come alone this time, leaving the house boarded against the prying eyes of the village. The whispers had started already, mad widow, kissing the dead, swearing they stirred. Let them talk, she knew what she felt. That soft pressure against her lips, the warmth blooming where there should have been none. Her children weren't gone. Not truly. She pressed her palm flat against the soil, willing it to yield, to part like the Red Sea for Moses. Nothing. Just the relentless patter of rain beginning to fall, turning the ground to mud. A rustle in the underbrush snapped her head up. Shadows shifted among the yews, and for a moment, she thought she saw a small figure darting between the trunks, pale, fleeting, like one of her little ones playing hide-and-seek. Her heart hammered. Eliza, she whispered, voice cracking. The figure paused, or so it seemed, a silhouette no taller than her waist, before melting into the mist. Pendleton rose unsteadily, skirts heavy with mud, and stumbled toward the trees. Branches whipped her face, drawing thin lines of blood, but she pushed on, calling softer now, afraid to shatter the fragile hope. Deeper in the woods, the air grew thicker, laced with the scent of damp leaves and decay. She stopped at a clearing where the graves of the Pendletons stretched back generations, their stones weathered to illegibility. There, half buried in moss, lay a doll, her daughter's, the one with the porcelain face and yarn hair, abandoned in the fever delirium. Pendleton snatched it up, clutching it to her chest. The doll's eyes, painted blue like Eliza's, seemed to follow her. And then, a giggle. Faint, like wind through reeds, but unmistakable. It came from the roots of an ancient oak, where the earth had cracked open in a jagged line, as if something below had clawed its way toward the surface. She dropped to her knees again, peering into the fissure. Darkness swallowed the light, but a small hand, impossibly small, with dirt-caked nails, reached up, fingers wiggling like they sought her grasp. Pendleton's breath caught. "My darling," she murmured, extending her own hand, trembling. The fingers brushed hers, cool and insistent, pulling gently. Not enough to drag her down, but enough to promise. Enough to make her lean closer, the rain now a steady drum on her back, blurring the line between sky and soil. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Eliza Pendleton knelt before the fresh mounds of earth. It was her third visit since the burying, each one pulling her deeper into the chill that seeped from the ground. The air smelled of damp soil and wilted roses, the kind her children had once plucked from the garden with sticky fingers. She traced the carved names, Thomas, aged 7, little Mary, just 4, with a trembling hand, the stone cold under her palm. A rustle in the underbrush made her start, heart pounding against her ribs. She hadn't told anyone about the kisses, not even Reverend Hale, who had prayed over the coffins with such fervor. But the memory gnawed at her, the way their lips had felt, soft and insistent, as if defying the stillness of death. Fever dreams, she'd whispered to herself that first night, bolting upright in her empty bed. Yet the house felt heavier now, the floorboards creaking under invisible weight. She rose, brushing dirt from her skirts, and glanced toward the iron gate. The village path wound back to her cottage, but something held her, a whisper, faint as wine through the yews. Eliza froze, ears straining. It sounded like Mary's giggle, high and bubbling, the one that used to chase away her husband's stern moods. Impossible. The children were gone, taken by the scarlet fever that swept the valley like a scythe. Turning back to the graves, she saw it, a small handprint in the mud, fresh and small-fingered, right at the edge of Thomas's plot. Her breath caught, and she dropped to her knees again, fingers hovering over the mark. It was no animal's paw, no trick of the light. The soil was soft, as if pressed moments ago. "Thomas," she murmured, voice cracking. The fog swirled, carrying the scent of lavender, Mary's favorite soap. By the time she stumbled home, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the threshold. The cottage door hung ajar, though she'd latched it tight that morning. Inside, the fire had died to embers, and a chill hung in the air despite the hearth. Eliza lit a candle, its flame flickering as if disturbed, and moved to the children's room. The beds were empty, of course, the linen stripped and folded away. But on Mary's pillow sat a single ribbon, blue and frayed, the one she'd tied in her daughter's hair just days before the fever broke them. She snatched it up, the fabric warm against her skin. A sob escaped her, muffled by the walls that seemed to lean in, listening. Downstairs, a floorboard groaned, then another, in the rhythm of small feet padding across the floor. Eliza gripped the ribbon tighter, whispering prayers she half believed, as the whispers began again, from the walls, from the dark corners, calling her name with voices too sweet to be ghosts. The fog clung to the graveyard like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Eliza Pendleton knelt before the small mound of earth that marked her children's grave. It had been 3 days since the fever claimed them both, little Thomas and Mary, gone in the night, their bodies cold by dawn. She had kissed their foreheads one last time, whispering promises of reunion, and in that moment, she swore she felt the faintest pressure against her lips, as if their spirits lingered, reaching back. The villagers whispered of madness, of a mother's grief twisting her mind, but Eliza knew better. The kisses had been real, a secret pact sealed in the dark. She traced the crude wooden cross with trembling fingers, the wood still fresh-hewn, splintering under her touch. The air carried the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves, and somewhere in the mist, a branch snapped. Eliza froze, her breath catching. It wasn't the wind, the trees stood too still. "Thomas?" "Mary," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. No answer came, only the slow seep of fog curling around her skirts like inquisitive fingers. Rising unsteadily, she gathered her shawl tighter and glanced toward the iron gate. Reverend Hargrove waited there, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray sky, his Bible clutched like a shield. He had insisted on accompanying her today, claiming it was for her soul's sake, but Eliza saw the curiosity in his eyes, the same wary fascination that had drawn the doctor and the midwife before him. "Mrs. Pendleton," he called softly, stepping forward with measured caution, "it's growing late. The chill will settle in your bones." She didn't turn immediately, her gaze fixed on the grave as if willing the earth to part. Another sound, a soft rustle, like silk on stone, came from behind the headstone. Eliza's pulse quickened, she could almost hear Mary's giggle, faint and echoing, as it had in the fevered nights. "Did you hear that?" she asked, whirling to face the Reverend. Her eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless vigils, searched his face for shared recognition. Hargrove hesitated, his thin lips pressing into a line. He was a man of 50, gaunt from years of austere living, with a voice that commanded sermons but faltered in the face of the uncanny. The wind, perhaps. Or a fox in the underbrush. "Come, let us pray together." He extended a hand, but Eliza recoiled, her mind flashing to the doctor's visit 2 nights prior, when he pried open the children's tiny coffins in the parlor, probing for signs of unnatural cause. The man had left pale, muttering about rigor mortis and impossible warmth, his instruments scattered like accusations. As they walked the winding path back to the village, the fog thickened, swallowing the tombstones one by one. Eliza's boots sank into the mud, each step pulling at her like the ground itself resisted her departure. Hargrove spoke of divine will, of trials that forged the faithful, but his words felt hollow, drifting away into the mist. She nodded absently, her thoughts snagged on the memory of those kisses, the cool brush of lips that warmed under hers, as if drawing breath from her own. What if they weren't gone? What if they waited, hungry for more? By the time they reached the cottage at the village edge, dusk had fallen, the windows glowing faintly from the hearth within. Widow Jenkins, Eliza's neighbor and the closest thing she had to kin since her husband's death in the mill accident, met them at the door. A sturdy woman of 40, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense gaze, she wiped flour from her apron and eyed the Reverend with mild suspicion. Brought her back safe, then? Tease on, if you've a mind for it. Hargrove declined politely, promising to return with holy water for a blessing. As he departed, his footsteps fading into the gloom, Jenkins pulled Eliza inside. The room was warm, cluttered with herbs drying by the fire and the faint aroma of stew. "You look like death itself," Jenkins said, guiding her to a chair. "What did the grave tell you this time?" Eliza sank down, her fingers twisting in her lap. She wanted to confess the rustle, the imagined laughter, but the words stuck. Instead, she stared at the empty cradle in the corner, where Mary had once cooed. "They kissed me back, Sarah. I felt it. Their lips, they moved." Jenkins paused in ladling the stew, her spoon hovering. She had heard the tale before, dismissed it as grief's cruel jest, but tonight her face tightened. "Fever plays tricks, Eliza. You know that. The doctor's report said they passed peaceful, no marks, no poison. Just the ague that took half the hollow last winter." Yet as she spoke, a shadow flitted across the windowpane, too quick for a bird, too deliberate for the wind. Jenkins glanced over, her hand tightening on the spoon. That night, as Eliza lay in her narrow bed, the cottage creaked under an unnatural quiet. The fire had died to embers, casting long shadows that danced like children at play. She drifted into uneasy sleep, dreaming of small hands tugging at her sleeves, of faces pale and insistent, pressing close. In the dream, the kisses multiplied, foreheads, cheeks, the curve of her neck, each one colder than the last, pulling her deeper into the earth. She awoke with a start to the sound of scratching at the door, faint but persistent, like nails on wood. Moonlight slanted through the cracks, illuminating the room in silver streaks. Jenkins snored softly in the next room, oblivious. Eliza sat up, heart hammering, and listened. The scratching paused, then resumed, 3 short rasps, then 2 long ones. A pattern, like the knocks Thomas used to make when hiding in the wardrobe. Barefoot, she crept to the door, her nightgown clinging to her sweat-damp skin. The latch felt heavy, resistant, but she lifted it anyway. The night air rushed in, carrying the scent of turned. The fog clung to the marshes like a shroud, thickening as Eliza Pendleton trudged deeper into the salt flats. Her boots sank into the muck with each step, the cold sludge sucking at her ankles, but she pressed on, the lantern in her hand casting a feeble glow that barely pierced the gloom. It had been 3 days since the whispers started in earnest, not the wind's idle murmurs, but voices, soft and insistent, calling her name from the reeds. "Mother," they breathed, and she knew those tones, etched into her bones from lullabies and bedtime pleas. The children were gone, buried in the churchyard with their father, felled by the fever that swept the village last winter. Yet here they were, pulling her toward the old widow's walk at the marsh's edge, where the ground turned treacherous and the tides whispered secrets. She paused, wiping sweat from her brow despite the chill. The air smelled of brine and decay, the kind that seeped into your lungs and made every breath a labor. Eliza's hands trembled as she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders, the one Mary had embroidered with tiny flowers before the sickness took her. Brave in the face of loss, Eliza had always been the steady one, the widow who mended nets for the fishermen and tended the sick without flinching. But now, doubt gnawed at her edges. Was this madness, born of grief? Or something fouler, stirred by the kiss that lingered on her lips like a promise, or a curse? A shape flickered in the mist ahead, low to the ground, darting between the twisted roots of mangroves. Eliza's heart stuttered. It was too small for a fox, too deliberate for a shadow. She raised the lantern higher, its flame sputtering in the damp. "Thomas? Is that you?" Her voice cracked, swallowed by the fog. No answer came, but the shape paused, turning toward her with eyes that gleamed like polished river stones. Not eyes, buttons. No, that was impossible. She blinked and it was gone, leaving only the echo of laughter, faint and bubbling like water over pebbles. The path narrowed here, the marsh giving way to the Widow's Walk, a crumbling boardwalk built decades ago for crabbers, now half sunk and splintered. Eliza stepped onto it cautiously, the wood groaning under her weight. Each plank felt alive, flexing as if breathing, and she imagined tiny hands pressing up from below, cool fingers brushing her soles. She shook her head, forcing the thought away. The villagers had warned her, stay clear of the flats at night, the fever wasn't the only thing the tides carried back. But she had to know. That night in the cottage, after the burying, she'd leaned over their still forms, pressing her lips to foreheads gone cold. And in the candlelight, she'd sworn, God help her, she'd felt the faintest pressure in return, a quiver like breath against her skin. A splash to her left yanked her from the memory. Something broke the surface of a nearby pool, ripples spreading outward in deliberate circles. Eliza froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. The lantern light danced across the water, illuminating a pale hand, small, delicate, reaching up from the murk. Mary's hand, with the faded ink stain on the thumb from her writing lessons. "Mama," came the whisper, clear now, laced with a child's impatience. Eliza dropped to her knees, heedless of the splinters, and extended her own hand. The fingers were icy, slick with algae, but they curled around hers with a grip that belied their fragility. Pulling back would have been wise, the walk's edge was perilously close, and the tide was rising, lapping at the boards like hungry tongues. But Eliza leaned forward, drawn by the impossible warmth blooming in her chest. "My darlings," she murmured, tears blurring the sight. The hand tugged gently, urging her closer to the pool's edge. Below, shadows stirred, two forms, indistinct, floating just beneath the surface. Thomas's curly hair, dark and matted, Mary's ribbon, frayed but red as blood. They turned their faces up, mouths parting in silent pleas. The board beneath her cracked, a sharp report like gunfire in the stillness. Eliza lurched backward, her hand slipping free, but not before she felt nails, tiny, sharp, dig into her palm. Blood welled, hot and real, dripping into the water where it vanished with a soft hiss. The shapes below thrashed once, then stilled, sinking deeper into the black. The whispers faded, replaced by the wind's mournful howl through the reeds. She scrambled to her feet, lantern swinging wildly, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the fog. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the metallic tang of blood on her tongue. This was no hallucination, the scratches burned, proof etched in her flesh. But what had she summoned? The children, or something wearing their skins? Eliza turned back toward the village lights, distant and mocking, her steps hurried now, the marsh seeming to close in behind her. The kiss had been a doorway, she realized, and she'd stepped through without a thought. Whatever waited on the other side, it hungered, and the night was far from over. The lantern's flame guttered low in the vicarage parlor, casting jagged shadows that clawed at the walls like the fingers of the unquiet dead. Widow Pendleton sat rigid in the armchair, her hands clenched around the arms until her knuckles gleamed white as bone. Father Elias paced before the hearth, his cassock whispering against the threadbare rug, while Eliza, the maid who'd stayed on out of pity or fear, hovered by the door, her eyes darting to the window where frost etched the panes like accusations. "You must understand, Mrs. Pendleton," the priest said, his voice a measured rumble, "the rites I've performed are binding. The salt lines at your thresholds, the prayers over the graves, they hold the veil firm. But if what you claim is true—" He trailed off, glancing at the locket she clutched, the one with the tiny portraits of her children, their faces frozen in painted smiles. She lifted her gaze, hollowed by nights without sleep. "True. I felt their lips, Father. Cold as the earth, yet pressing back against mine. Thomas's breath, faint as a sigh from the crypt, and little Mary's fingers twitching in my hair. Her words hung in the air, sharp as the chill seeping through the cracks. Eliza stifled a gasp, crossing herself hastily. The priest stopped pacing, kneeling before her with a gentleness that belied the tremor in his hands. The fever took them swiftly, God rest their souls. Grief plays cruel tricks on the mind. I've seen it before, in the war, men whispering to shadows of the fallen. But even as he spoke, doubt flickered in his eyes, for the village whispers had reached him too. The grave digger swearing the earth over the Pendleton plot had shifted overnight, as if something below stirred restlessly. A knock rattled the door, sudden and insistent, like bones tapping on wood. Eliza jumped, her apron twisting in her fists. Who could that be, at this hour, she murmured, but the widow was already rising, her skirts rustling like dry leaves. Father Elias barred her path with an outstretched arm. Stay. I'll see to it. He moved to the door, cracking it open to the swirling snow beyond. Constable Harrow stood there, his lantern swinging, face ruddy from the cold and something darker, urgency, perhaps fear. Snowflakes clung to his whiskers like tiny shrouds. Evening, Father. Mrs. Pendleton. Harrow's gaze slid past the priest, locking onto the widow. Trouble at the cemetery. The groundskeeper found marks on the stones. Like hands had clawed from below. The room seemed to contract, the air thickening with unspoken dread. Eliza whimpered, backing into the corner where the shadows pooled deepest. The widow's breath caught, a ragged sound that echoed the wind's howl outside. She stepped forward, ignoring the priest's warning hand. Show me. Harrow hesitated, then nodded grimly. Best you see for yourself. But bring the lantern. Night's no friend to the living, or the otherwise. They bundled into cloaks and stepped into the storm, the vicarage door slamming shut behind them like a coffin lid. The path to the hilltop graveyard wound treacherous underfoot, slick with ice that cracked like brittle bones. Father Elias led, muttering Latin under his breath, while Eliza trailed, her footsteps faltering. The widow moved with a purpose that bordered on defiance, the locket warm against her chest as if holding a spark of forbidden life. At the cemetery gate, the iron creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Lantern light spilled across the headstones, illuminating fresh gouges in the frozen soil, deep furrows, as if small hands had scraped for purchase. The children's graves lay at the center, their mounds undisturbed save for those telltale scratches, radiating outward like pleas etched in desperation. Kneeling, the widow traced one mark with trembling fingers. The earth was cold, unyielding, yet beneath her touch, a faint vibration hummed, like a heartbeat, muffled and insistent. They're calling, she whispered, her voice breaking the night's hush. They want to come home. Harrow shifted uneasily, his hand resting on his pistol. Ma'am, this could be animals. Foxes, but the priest silenced him with a look, his face paling as he pressed his ear to the ground. The vibration strengthened, a subtle pulse that set the snow trembling. From the depths, a sound rose, not a cry, but a soft, wet smack, like lips parting in the dark. Eliza screamed then, the sound tearing through the gale, and they all recoiled as the soil buckled slightly over Thomas's plot, a tiny fissure, exhaling frost-laced breath that carried the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay mingled with something warmer, almost alive. The widow reached out, compelled, her hand hovering over the crack. Stop! Father Elias yanked her back, his rosary beads scattering like fallen teeth. We must seal it now, but the fissure widened just a fraction, and in that moment, a small, pale hand, impossibly clean, impossibly cold, breached the surface, fingers curling toward her with a familiarity that shattered the night. The fog clung to the graveyard like a shroud, muting the toll of the distant church bell as Widow Pendleton knelt before the fresh mound of earth. Her fingers, raw from clawing at the soil earlier, now traced the crude wooden cross marking Eliza's grave. The third child in as many nights, first Thomas, then little Mary, and now the baby girl, all taken by the fever that swept the village like a thief in the dark. But it wasn't the fever that haunted her dreams. It was the kiss. She had felt it again last night, after the doctor had pronounced Eliza gone and the undertaker had carted the tiny body away. Pendleton had stolen into the cellar where the children lay wrapped in linens, their faces pale as moonlight. She pressed her lips to Eliza's cold forehead, whispering promises of heaven she no longer believed in. And then, the faintest pressure, a sigh against her skin, as if the child stirred in response. Not breath, but something colder, hungrier. Now, in the grey dawn, Pendleton's breath came in shallow bursts. The village elder, Mr. Hargrove, had warned her to stay away from the graves. "It's grief playing tricks, woman," he'd said, his voice rough as gravel. "Digging up the dead won't bring them back." But Hargrove was a widower himself, his own losses buried deep under layers of piety and rum. He didn't understand the pull, the certainty gnawing at her bones. She glanced over her shoulder at the silhouette of her cottage on the hill, its windows dark. Inside, the house felt emptier than ever, the silence broken only by the creak of settling beams, or was it footsteps? Pendleton shook her head, forcing her gaze back to the earth. The soil was loose, disturbed in patches, as if small hands had pushed from below. Her heart stuttered. "Eliza," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leaves. A rustle came from the tree-line, and Pendleton froze. Not the wind, too deliberate, too close. She rose slowly, her skirts heavy with dew, and peered into the mist. Father Ellis emerged, his black robes blending with the shadows, a lantern swinging from his hand. The priest's face was gaunt, etched with lines that hadn't been there a week ago. Since Thomas's burial, he'd taken to visiting her nightly, murmuring prayers that rang hollow in the empty rooms. "Widow," he said, his voice low, urgent. "You mustn't come here alone. The fever's not the only thing stirring in Blackwood." Pendleton's hand tightened on the cross. "They kissed me back, Father. All of them. It's not grief, it's them, calling me." Ellis stepped closer, the lantern light flickering across his eyes, which darted to the grave. "The Lord tests us in strange ways. But desecrating holy ground, it invites darkness." He paused, glancing at the disturbed earth. "I saw tracks last night, small ones, leading from your door to the woods. Like children's feet, but backward." She followed his gaze, and a chill seeped through her shawl. The prints were there, faint in the mud, tiny, imprinted heel to toe, as if the bearers walked away from the grave instead of toward it. Pendleton's stomach twisted. "They can't be alive." "Not alive," Ellis murmured, crossing himself. "But bound. The kiss you spoke of, it's a mark. Old tales from the moors, before the church came. Mothers who wouldn't let go, children who wouldn't stay buried." The bell tolled again, closer now, and from the village path came the sound of hooves. Hargrove rode up on his old mare, his face flushed beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted heavily, eyeing the two of them. "Heard you were out here, widow. And you, father, skulking about like a fox. What's this about tracks?" Ellis straightened, but Pendleton spoke first, her voice steadier than she felt. "The children aren't resting, Mr. Hargrove. They're coming back." The elder scoffed, but his eyes betrayed unease as he scanned the graves. "Foolishness. The doctor's coming today with men from town. They're saying it's not fever, something in the water, or worse. But if your little ones are wandering—" He trailed off, pulling a flask from his coat and taking a swig. "We burn the bodies at dusk if the signs worsen. No more half measures." Pendleton recoiled. "Burn them? They're my babies." "Better than what they're becoming," Hargrove muttered, turning to Ellis. "You agree, don't you, priest? Or are you spinning more of your ghost stories?" Ellis's lantern hand trembled. "The rites must be observed. But if the widow's right—" He looked at her, his expression fracturing. "We need to go to the house. Now. Before nightfall. As they hurried back up the hill, the fog thickened, swallowing the graveyard whole. Pendleton felt it then, a soft tug at her hem, like fingers brushing her ankle. She didn't look down. The cottage door stood ajar, a sliver of shadow spilling out, and inside, the air hummed with a child's faint, impatient hum. The fog clung to the gravestones like a shroud, muting the distant toll of the church bell as Eliza Pendleton knelt before the fresh mound of earth. Her fingers, raw from scraping at the frozen ground earlier that morning, now traced the crude wooden marker her brother had hammered into place. "Beloved children," it read, the letters uneven, as if the chisel had trembled in his hand. She had come alone this time, leaving the vicar's insistent prayers behind in the cottage. The air smelled of damp soil and decay, a scent that twisted in her gut like a knife. She pressed her lips to the cold dirt, whispering their names, Thomas, little Mary, willing the earth to part and give them back. In the quiet, she heard it again, the soft rustle, not whine through the yew trees, but something deliberate, like fingers brushing against wood from below. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. Not here, under the watchful eyes of the saints carved into the chapel wall. Yet the ground seemed to shift, a subtle heave that made pebbles skitter away. Rising unsteadily, Eliza wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting loam and something sweeter, like the milk that had soured on their lips in death. The village path wound back toward home, but she veered instead toward the old mill at the river's edge, where the water churned black under the overcast sky. Dr. Hargrove had mentioned it once, in a hushed tone after examining the bodies. The fever came from the upstream waters, tainted by the tannery waste. But some say older things stir when the dead don't rest. She had dismissed him then, clinging to grief's sharp edge, but now doubt gnawed at her resolve. The mill will groaned as she approached, its spokes slick with moss. Inside, the air was thick with dust motes dancing in the slivers of light from cracked boards. She lit a stub of candle from her apron pocket, the flame flickering against sacks of forgotten grain. There, in the corner, lay the bundle she had hidden weeks ago, a locket with locks of their hair, and the small clay figures they had molded by the hearth, faces smeared with childish grins. As she unwrapped them, a drop of wax fell onto one, and the figure seemed to twitch, or was it her hand shaking? Footsteps echoed from the doorway. Eliza spun, heart pounding. It was Widow Green, the herbalist from the hollow, her face gaunt under a threadbare shawl. "They call to you still, don't they?" the old woman rasped, eyes gleaming unnaturally in the dimness. Eliza nodded, unable to speak, as Green stepped closer, her gnarled fingers clutching a vial of dark liquid. "The kiss binds them. But to free them, you must drown the echo." Green's words hung heavy, laced with the scent of nightshade and river mud. She poured a measure of the vial into Eliza's palm, the liquid cold as grave water. "Drink, and lead them back across." Eliza hesitated, the memory of those final kisses flooding her, soft, too soft, lips parting as if in reply. With a trembling breath, she tipped her hand to her mouth, the bitterness coating her tongue like ash. The world tilted. Shadows lengthened along the mill walls, coalescing into small shapes that darted at the edge of vision. Laughter, faint and echoing, bubbled up from the floorboards. Eliza stumbled toward the river door, Green's hand steady on her arm. Outside, the water rushed hungrily, swallowing the fog in greedy laps. She could feel them now, pulling at her skirts, their touch feather-light but insistent, urging her forward. As she teetered on the bank, the vial slipped from her fingers, shattering against a rock. Green whispered a chant, words twisting like roots in the earth, but Eliza heard only the children's voices, clear and pleading, "Mother, come play." The current tugged at her boots, and for a moment, she leaned in, ready to follow. Then a shout pierced the haze, her brother's voice, distant but fierce, crashing through the trees with lantern light bobbing behind. He burst into view, face twisted in alarm, grabbing her wrist just as the water lapped at her knees. "Eliza! What devilry is this?" Green melted into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. Eliza collapsed against him, the pull fading but leaving an ache in her chest, deeper than before. The children were silent now, but she knew they waited, their kisses lingering on her skin like promises unkept. As they trudged back to the village, the river's murmur followed, a lullaby laced with warning. Elias hunched in the shadowed alcove of the Pendleton parlor, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and melting tallow. His lantern cast erratic flickers across the walls, where portraits of stern ancestors seemed to lean inward, their painted eyes hollowed by years of soot. Widow Pendleton had vanished upstairs hours ago, her footsteps fading like whispers swallowed by the house's endless creaks. He clutched the iron key in his pocket, the one she'd pressed into his hand before the fever claimed her last coherent words, "Lock it all away." They hunger for more than kisses now. The children, those pale, unblinking effigies in the attic, waited, their small forms arranged as if in eternal play, lips stained with the faint rouge of her final embraces. A low moan drifted from the floorboards above, not quite human, threading through the silence like smoke. Elias's pulse quickened. He'd come as the village undertaker, tasked with sealing the house after her death, but the rumors had drawn him deeper. Whispers in the tavern spoke of her madness, of nights when she'd called to the graves in the yard, claiming their tiny hands reached back through the soil. He rose, boots scraping softly on the threadbare rug, and made for the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, the banister slick with what might have been condensation, or something colder, stickier. At the landing, the door to the attic stood ajar, a sliver of moonlight piercing the gloom like a blade. Elias paused, breath shallow, remembering the doctor's account from weeks prior. The children had died of the flux, their bodies blue and still, yet she'd insisted on washing them herself, murmuring lullabies as if they stirred. He pushed the door wider, the hinges sighing in protest. The attic smelled of earth and decay, mingled with the faint, sickly sweet perfume she favored, lavender laced with something metallic, like blood under frost. There, in the center of the room, sat the cradle. It rocked gently, though no wind stirred the air. Elias's lantern trembled in his grip, illuminating the bundles within, two small shapes, shrouded in white linen, their faces obscured but for the barest hint of cheek, pale as porcelain. He stepped closer, heart hammering against his ribs, and knelt. The key burned in his pocket, a talisman against the unnatural. "Mrs. Pendleton," he called softly, voice cracking. No answer, only the cradle's rhythmic creak, as if tiny feet pushed against its sides. From the shadows behind the stack of forgotten trunks, a rustle emerged. Elias whipped the lantern around, light spilling over a figure huddled in the corner, the widow, though she'd been buried 3 days past. She turned, eyes wide and glassy, her nightgown torn at the hem, dirt caking her nails as if she'd clawed her way from the grave. "They came back," she whispered, lips moving in a smile that didn't reach her gaze. "My darlings. They kiss now, Elias. Feel it." She extended a hand, fingers curled like claws, and in the dim glow, he saw the marks on her skin, delicate imprints, like the press of cold mouths. He stumbled back, the lantern clattering to the floor. Wax pooled and hissed, shadows leaping across the walls in frantic dance. The cradle stopped rocking, and from beneath the shrouds, a soft sigh escaped, synchronized with the widow's breath. Elias fumbled for the key, jamming it into the attic door's ancient lock as he retreated, but her voice pursued him down the stairs, a lilting song twisted into plea, "Join us. One kiss, and you'll never be alone." By dawn, the house stood silent once more, the key turned in every door, every window latched against the creeping fog rolling in from the moors. Elias fled to his cart, hands shaking as he lit a pipe to steady them. But in the rear view of his mind, the attic lingered, the cradle's sway, the widow's unblinking stare, and the faint, wet smack of lips parting in the dark. The village would call it fever dreams, blame the damp autumn chills. Yet as he drove away, a chill settled in his bones, deeper than any earth's embrace, whispering of kisses that bound tighter than death. The fog clung to the graveyard like a shroud, thick and unyielding, muffling the distant toll of the church bell. Eliza Pendleton's boots sank into the damp earth as she trudged toward the family plot, her lantern swinging low, casting erratic shadows that danced like specters among the headstones. Her breath came in shallow bursts, the cold seeping through her woolen shawl, but it was the weight in her chest that slowed her steps, the unyielding certainty that tonight would demand everything she had left. She'd come alone this time, leaving the vicar and his prying questions behind. The children's graves waited at the far end, marked by simple stones she'd carved herself with trembling hands, beloved Thomas, aged 7, and darling Mary, aged 5. The earth over them had settled unevenly, as if the soil itself remembered the fever that had claimed them 3 months past. Eliza knelt, setting the lantern down, its flame flickering against the mist. Her fingers, raw from endless scrubbing, brushed the grass-grown mound. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the wind's low moan. "Like I promised." It had started with the kisses. In the dim parlor, as she bid them farewell, their lips, cold as autumn rain, had pressed back against hers, soft and insistent. She'd told no one at first, not even the midwife who'd pronounced them gone. But the whispers grew, echoing in the empty house, faint giggles in the walls, tiny feet pattering overhead when she lay awake. Then the dreams, vivid as daylight, where Thomas tugged her sleeve and Mary clutched her skirts, their eyes bright but hollow, begging her to follow. Now, the air hummed with something darker. Eliza pulled the small bundle from her apron, a lock of her own hair, tied with ribbon from Mary's doll, and a splinter of wood from Thomas's broken toy horse. The vicar had called it folly, burning such things to sever unholy ties, but she knew better. These were bridges, not chains. She pressed the bundle to the earth, murmuring the words she'd pieced together from old journals in the attic, fragments of lore from her grandmother's lips, return not as shadows, but as light. Let the veil thin, and come whole. The ground trembled, subtle at first, like a sigh from deep below. Eliza's heart pounded, her palms slick against the soil. She dug her nails in, willing it to be them, her babies, freed from whatever limbo held them. The lantern sputtered, the flame dipping low, and in its wavering light, the mist parted just enough to reveal shapes. Small, indistinct at the edges, but there, a boy's outline, sturdy-legged, and beside him a girl's, curls framing a face too pale. "Mama." The word slithered from the fog, not from a mouth but from everywhere, threading through the air like smoke. Eliza froze, joy warring with the ice in her veins. It was Thomas's voice, unchanged, but laced with an echo that pulled at her ears. "I'm here, my loves." She reached out, her hand trembling toward the shapes. They solidified slightly, hands extending, tiny, cold fingers brushing hers. Mary's touch first, feather-light, then Thomas's, gripping with a strength that belied his size. But as they drew closer, the air grew heavy, tasting of rot and river mud. Their eyes, when they met hers, gleamed not with life but with a hunger that mirrored the grave's endless appetite. Something shifted beneath her knees. The earth buckled, a soft rending sound like tearing cloth. Roots, pale and veined, snaked up from the soil, coiling around her ankles. Not roots, limbs, thin and insistent, pulling her down. Eliza gasped, yanking back, but the children's grasp tightened. "Stay with us," Mary cooed, her voice a melody twisted wrong. "We missed you. Kiss us again." Panic clawed up Eliza's throat. This wasn't reunion, it was reclamation. The bundle in her hand burned now, the ribbon charring as if lit from within. She tore it free, scattering the contents into the mist. The shapes wavered, a wail rising, high, piercing, like wind through cracked bones. The ground heaved, headstones tilting, and Eliza scrambled back, her skirts snagging on thorns that hadn't been there moments before. She ran then, lantern forgotten, the fog closing in like a living thing. Behind her, the laughter bubbled up, not joyful but insatiable, following on footsteps that pattered too swiftly, too many. The church loomed ahead, its door ajar, but as she lunged for it, a small hand caught her hem. She kicked free, slamming the door shut, the wood shuddering under frantic blows from the other side. Inside, the nave was silent, candles guttering in the draught. Eliza collapsed against the pew, chest heaving, her skin crawling where they'd touched. The kisses had been real, yes, but so was the pull, the endless downward drag. Dawn crept through the stained glass, painting the floor in bloody hues, and she wondered if she'd severed the tie or merely delayed it. The house waited empty across the green, but now it felt like a trap, and the graves hungered still. Eleanor Pendleton stood at the edge of the frost-rimed graveyard, the winter wind slicing through her shawl like a blade honed by grief. The moon hung low, bloated and indifferent, casting elongated shadows from the crooked headstones. Her children, little Thomas and Eliza, lay beneath the frozen earth once more, their small coffins resealed after the unspeakable nights that had followed her desperate kisses. The doctor's warnings echoed in her mind, sharp as the chill. "It's the fever's delusion, Mrs. Pendleton. Let them rest." But she had felt their lips, cold yet insistent, pressing back against hers in the dim candlelight of the parlor. Father Harlan approached from the church path, his boots crunching the snow with deliberate steps. He was a sturdy man, his face etched with lines from too many consolations, but tonight his eyes held a flicker of resolve rather than pity. Beside him walked Dr. Whitaker, the town physician, clutching a leather satchel that bulged with vials and instruments. They had come at her summons, despite the whispers that branded her a madwoman. "Eleanor," the priest said softly, his breath clouding the air, "the rites are prepared. If there's truth to what you've seen, we'll face it together." She nodded, her gloved hands trembling as they gripped the iron gate. The challenge had begun weeks ago, not with thunderous apparitions but a subtle unraveling, the children's laughter echoing from empty rooms, their tiny handprints fogging the windows on windless nights. The town had called it hysteria, born of the cholera that claimed them, but Eleanor knew better. The kisses had awakened something, an old hunger, perhaps tied to the unmarked graves of Pendletons long buried here, folk tales of restless spirits clinging to the living. The risk was clear: if she couldn't sever the bond, it would consume her, drawing her down to join them in eternal, twisted reunion. They moved as a unit toward the family plot, the doctor's lantern swinging like a pendulum, its glow revealing the fresh mound over the twins' grave. Eliza's doll, the one with the porcelain face cracked from her fall, lay half-buried nearby, a remnant Eleanor couldn't bear to retrieve. "The salt line first," Whitaker murmured, kneeling to pour a circle of white grains around the earth. His hands, usually steady in surgery, shook slightly. He was no believer in the supernatural, yet the scratches on his own arm, faint echoes of a child's nails, had convinced him otherwise. Harlan began the incantation in Latin, his voice steady against the gathering wind that rattled the bare branches overhead. Eleanor knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the snow, and placed her palm flat on the grave. The ground felt unnaturally warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat buried too deep. Tension coiled in her chest as memories flooded back, the first night, when Thomas's pale lips had brushed hers, whispering promises of play in the dark. The plan had been simple at dawn: exorcise the tie through prayer and science, Whitaker's herbs to dull the spectral pull, Harlan's faith to banish it. But in the middle hours, as the sun dipped, the apparitions had grown bolder, their forms flickering at the edges of vision, tugging at her skirts with invisible fingers. Now, as the priest's words rose, the air thickened. A soft giggling drifted up from the soil, muffled but unmistakable, Eliza's trill, the one that used to summon Thomas to games by the hearth. Eleanor's breath hitched, she pressed harder, whispering their names like a plea. "Let go, my darlings. Mama's here, but you must sleep." The doctor uncorked a vial, splashing a bitter elixir over the mound. It hissed faintly, steam rising in curls that twisted into fleeting shapes, tiny arms reaching. The wind howled then, whipping snow into their faces, and the ground trembled. Cracks spiderwebbed the frost, and for a heartbeat, Eleanor swore she saw pale fingers clawing upward, slick with mud. Harlan's chant faltered, his cross clutched white-knuckled, but he pressed on, voice rising. "In nomine Patris." Whitaker grabbed her shoulder, pulling her back as the earth bucked, a child's voice crying out, hurt, hungry, eternal. She resisted, leaning into the chaos, her own lips forming the words she'd rehearsed alone, a mother's farewell, not a kiss but a release. "I love you beyond this world," she said aloud, the words cutting through the gale. The giggling stuttered, then waned, replaced by a sigh that rustled the leaves like a final breath. The trembling eased, the fingers withdrew, the cracks sealing with a soft grind of soil. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breathing. The grave lay still, the warmth fading to the night's bite. Harlan lowered his cross, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. "It's done," he said, though his eyes searched the shadows. Whitaker packed his satchel, avoiding her gaze, the scratches on his arm already paling to scars. Eleanor rose, legs numb, and turned from the plot. The doll caught her eye one last time, its cracked face half-smile in the moonlight. She left it there, a marker of what was lost and what lingered. As they walked back toward the church lights, a faint pressure ghosted her cheek, like a kiss, or perhaps just the wind. She didn't turn back. The bond was broken, but in the quiet of her heart, she knew some echoes never fully fade, they wait, patient as winter, for the next thaw.